Hi, Dr. B for CRPC here with part 3 of our series of Let's Take Over the World, which is a brief examination of promises that God has given us in His scriptures of how there will be Christian victory in the world before the Lord returns and ushers in the eternal state. Part 1 were 7 New Testament promises of victory before the Lord returns. Part 2, we looked at self-government, how basically the victory that Christ has promised in the world begins first when he starts changing us as individuals. And then part 3 here, the one we're going to look at today, is God's plan for the family and how that works in terms of his victory in the world. Now, without a doubt, the family is the foundation of any stable social order. If I was good at editing, I'd go back and take that out. But instead, I'll show you just how human and fallible and sinful I actually am. But anyway, going back to the main point, every single study that's ever been done shows there's a direct correlation, a direct relationship between an intact two-parent family and the possibility that the children will grow up to be stable, mature, responsible, law-abiding, productive, prosperous individuals. In fact, if you take away most commonly the father, but take away an intact two-parent family, then the children of that family are far more likely to become drug addicts, to become involved and have premarital sex and out of wedlock children, and basically to have to suffer poverty and crime and all sorts of really, really bad things. If you want to be able to solve the crime problem in America, for example, you don't have to pass more laws. You don't have to build more jails. You don't have to get harder on criminals. You just have to get moms and dads to get married and stay married, and then to raise their kids together. And that in of itself is the greatest indicator that those kids will avoid crime and violence and all the bad things that happen. As R.J. Rushdoony, who was my mentor and my PhD advisor, once said, that the family is the child's first school, his first church, and his first state. And what he meant by that is that the child learns most of what it means to be a human within the context of the family. The child first learns about God from his parents and how they relate. He learns about government, how to control his appetites, what rules and regulations are, because the head of the household sets down rules and regulations and teaches him to obey them, and the sanctions that happen when you disobey those particular things. God even puts it this way in Deuteronomy 6 and following, and I'm going to read this to you here from New American Standard. It says, "These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Now, do you see what God's saying there? Through Moses, God's saying, look, you Israelites, here's my law. Now, I want you guys to talk about them. I want you to teach them to your sons and daughters. I want you to talk about them when you stand up, when you sit down. I want you to put them over the doorposts of your house and on the gates as you come in. So everywhere you look around you, I want you to see my law. You have a responsibility to teach my law. Now, it's very significant, I think, that in the book of Judges, where basically everyone knows we have this cycle where Israel falls into sin and God sends an oppressor, and then they repent and they cry out to God, then God sends a deliverer, and then everything is hunky-dory and wonderful for about 40 years. And then the people of Israel fall back into sin. And the question that I asked back when I was in college and seminary, and I asked my professors is, well, why did Israel continue to fall back into sin? And nobody really had a great answer. I'm not saying there wasn't an answer. I'm just saying that none of my professors had one. But when I read this particular verse and I compared it to what was happening there in the book of Judges, it hit me. Basically, if you follow it out, while the people who were delivered are alive, the people of Israel are blessed. As soon as that generation dies off, the next generation growing up falls back into sin. Now, even though the text doesn't necessarily say this, it seems to me fairly reasonable, fairly logical that what was happening is that the parents, as sincere as their own faith was, they were not teaching their children according to Deuteronomy 6:6. The kids never heard the law. The kids forgot God because their parents were not teaching them what God had told them to do back here in Deuteronomy 6:6 and following. Now, I think this is tremendously significant. And I think that if you look back at history, whenever the church has been weak, whenever the church has come under attack, whenever the godlessness or paganism, I think you can trace it back to the fathers forgetting to teach their children the law of God. Now, by the way, if you think about this, that the family is the foundation for a stable social order, and the parents have a responsibility to teach the children and to basically to give them that head start. It also then demonstrates why God is really upset about certain things that today we don't like. In fact, I'm going to suggest that the reason why most Christians are really crazy when it comes about the law of God, hating the law of God is probably not an exaggeration at all. They hate it. They detest it because the Old Testament law says these horrible things like adultery and homosexuality and such things are capital crimes. And that drives the modern Christian crazy because they think, oh, well, God is so harsh and so mean and that's so nasty. And so surely something must have happened. You know, that's for the Old Testament. Something new has happened today. And so we don't have to pay attention to that. But think about this just for a moment. If, in fact, the family is fundamental, a sound family, a good family, is fundamental to the health of society, does that not make sense then that God would say the sins that affect the integrity of the family are really, really bad stuff? Think about it this way. Your whole body can be healthy. You can have strong arms and thick thighs and, big bulging pectoral muscles. But then right inside, in a little part of your lung, there's a little tumor that starts to grow. Now, if you don't deal with that tumor, before you know it, that little tiny tumor can take that 6 foot 4 inch, 220 pound, muscle bound, Arnold Schwarzenegger lookalike, and basically kill him in a very short amount of time. You got to attack the cancer. You got to get it out. If you don't get it out, it kills the whole body. Maybe that's why God put such heavy strictures on, such things as sodomy and adultery and things like that. Think about it this way. What would you say about a person who betrayed his country? Someone who sold secrets to the enemy, who gave aid and comfort to the enemy, who basically gave information that would lead to your country being destroyed or being conquered by an enemy. That's a traitor. Pardon me. And if you caught such a man doing it, what kind of punishment do you think would be appropriate? Well, according to American law, death penalty. People who betray their country, they're liable for capital punishment. Interesting enough that the Bible doesn't understand or doesn't have a category called treason, at least not to the state, but it does have a category called treason to the family. Because when you destroy the integrity of the family, you're destroying more than just a personal relationship between two people. You're destroying all the other people in that family as well. Therefore, for a family to function, every single person involved, the husband, the father, the wife, the mother, the child, the sibling, the parent, the child, all these things, they have to understand what God expects from them, and they have to be personally committed to fulfilling that in order to make the family work. The problem is this. You can throw the word family out, but what do you mean by family? Now, throughout history, different cultures have defined the family in different ways. Do you mean that the family is that a father owns his own children and can barter his daughters off as he please, that women are second-class citizens who cannot own property and they got to shut up and go in the kitchens and make me a sandwich? Do we mean the modern concept of dad and mom and 2.2 kids? Or what about the modern craze about unmarried families or serial monogamous families where, parents get married and they have kids, they get divorced, they get married, and they blend families together? Well, I think Paul warns us all the way back in Romans 12 too about the dangers of letting the world squeeze us into its own mold. It says, do not be conformed by the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And this word conform, literally in Greek, it means kind of like being squeezed into the mold. Pardon me. And the problem that we have to deal with is that culture has this tendency to want to squeeze us, to transform us into its own image. Now, we got to go back for a moment, take a step back and think about this. From the very beginning, when Adam and Eve first sinned, the basic orientation of all human beings, the sinful orientation, is to want to be God, to determine good and evil on their own. And so as men build families, as men build cultures, as men build civilizations, then basically the more consistent they tend to try to make the rules and regulations, to ignore God and work things out the way that they want to do. The more consistently that men live in rebellion to God, the more difficult they find life to be, because this world was created by God to reflect his glory, his nature, and his being. So if you're going to live successfully, you've got to live to the way that God really created the world, not the way you think he created the world, not the way you want the world to operate. It's kind of like, just as an example, I think in the 20th century, the most evil, wicked perversion that ever existed in the 20th century was Marxism, communism. Throughout the 20th century, the Marxists probably killed, nobody knows how many, some estimates as low as 50 million, and that's really on the low side. Between all the Russians, between Stalinists, the Maoists, etc., the figure may well be as high as 200, 250 million. Nobody knows for sure. All we know is that at least tens of millions of people were butchered by their own governments, by the Marxists. The problem is that Marxism was a failed economic system. It couldn't possibly work because it was based upon unbiblical views of man. In fact, the only reason why the Soviet Union lasted as long as it did is because Western nations fed them. We grew grain in our country, and in the West, and we sold it to the Russians, and then we sold them our technology. Lenin, I think, once said it this way. He said, if we announced tomorrow that we're going to hang all the capitalists, they would be fighting each other to see which one gets to sell us the rope. And that's exactly what we did. If we had not subsidized the Soviet Union since the 1920s, the Soviet Union would have collapsed a long time ago. Instead, it took till 1991. And the same thing about China, for example. The only reason that China continues to call us, they're not a communist country. They're a dictatorship. They were smart enough to go, wait a minute, they're basically more like fascists. They basically are state-owned, corporations that encourage, private economic kind of activity in order to keep the thing going. But it's a hopelessly corrupt nation. But there's an oligarchy. It's not communism. They use communism because it's what sells. Basically it's the mythos. They can't back out of it now, but they're not communists either. My point being is that if you want to live and live productively, you've got to live in the world the way it is. And science and technology and all that kind of good stuff are simply ways that we use to figure out how God has created his world and how we can bring our ways in conformity to it. Now, the problem is that men don't do that. And so as a consequence, throughout history, men have attempted, because they're sinful, then they want to abuse the positions that they have been given, and they create cultures that are often very anti-family. They're often very wicked and very bad. For example, environmental determinists, for example, when they look at the history of the family, they'll say, well, there's no such thing as a family because, different cultures have manifested the family in different ways depending upon their social, economic, and environmental forces. And, there's a little bit of truth to that because men are forced to live in accordance with the world as it is, then they can't always be as consistent with their rebellion against God in the family as they might like to be. But, for example, an environmental determinist might say something like the following: how women are regarded in a pre-industrial agrarian culture. And what they notice is that throughout the world, as far as we can tell, no matter where we go, what society we look at, In a agrarian pre-industrial culture, male children are very highly valued and female children are devalued. And the reason why, they suggest, is because male children can do more work. And according to some of the stuff I've read, and I don't know how whether it works out or not, but at least it kind of fits. It kind of makes sense. It's plausible anyway. Basically, it takes almost as many calories to feed an adult woman as it does to feed an adult male. In fact, she does, maybe she eats maybe like three-quarters the same amount. However, she can only do two-thirds the amount of work because men are stronger. They have bigger muscles. And so when it comes to like agricultural work, like pulling a plow or, hoeing and, doing real serious kinds of work that needs to be done, women cannot do as much work as a man. If you've got lots of sons, you've got lots of workers. That means that you can put more ground into cultivation, you can harvest more crops before the weather turns bad, and therefore you're better off. You've got more crops to feed yourself. If you've got excess, you can sell it, and you can be wealthier, etc. However, if you've got a lot of daughters and not so many sons, they will work, they'll work really, really hard, but they can't work as hard as the men. And so if you have a bad harvest, or if it's just a drought during the summer, or maybe an early frost, then these women could not work as hard, and so you basically might not get enough of the crop in. You might not get enough crop, and so your family could starve literally. And therefore, in all pre-industrial, agrarian type cultures, women, their value has nothing to do, their value is very much lower. And so what happens is that these cultures tend to want to get rid of their excess daughters as quickly as possible. And this is where you have the creation of real patriarchies, where, there's one particular individual in a community, for example, where maybe he's got the best land, he's a better worker, he has more sons, whatever. He becomes rich and successful. Other families around him, they've got these excess children. They don't know what to do with them. They're these daughters because, and so basically he buys the daughters, pays a bride price for them, takes them into his home. He feeds them. He takes care of them. He has access to them, etc. So it eliminates a liability over in this family, and it gives him something over here. And that's kind of like some of the explanation of why these cultures and why these societies grow up. However, notice this is contrary to the way that God reveals it in Scripture. In fact, what we have is that God creates Adam and Eve. And then when, they have sons, then those sons have a wife. And it's only in the third generation after that, or fourth generation, that men start sinning and they start having multiple wives. Now, we don't have time to talk about this today, and I know some of you would really like to talk about that, but polygamy in the Old Testament. But I'm just going to throw this out for you, and just, if you don't believe me, just go through check. God does, in fact, in the law, regulate polygamy. He actually says, okay, if this is what you're going to do, these are the rules you got to follow to do it. But remember what the Lord Jesus says, that he didn't create polygamy. He created, monogamy, one man and one woman. That's the way he intended it to be. Every single instance that we have in the Old Testament of a polygamous relationship is an unmitigated disaster for everyone involved. There is factionalism, fighting, rape, incest, murder. They're horrible. Every single example of polygamy in the Old Testament is an unmitigated disaster for every single member of the family. I don't think God could have put it any clearer than that. Okay, look, you sinful individuals, you guys are going to do this? All right, this is not what I want you to do. Okay, I'm going to let you get away with it, but you're not going to enjoy what you get. See, people today have this stupid, idiotic fantasy about having their own private harem or whatever, and they may not want to talk about it, but that's what's going on in the back of their mind. And they don't want to deal with the reality. The reality is it's a disaster. Don't do it. What we're trying to get at here is that even though wicked men will build wicked cultures, they will also build then wicked families. They'll build perversions of it. But however, what we've got to keep in mind is that because God created the world, cultures that are under his judgment, that wander too far away from his principles, simply die. We don't have time to look at this, but But in your own time, I challenge you, go read Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, this is a promise that God gives to Israel. And he basically says, look, guys, if you obey me, if you love me, if you serve me, I'm going to bless you. Man, I'm going to bless your fields. I'm going to bless your herds. I'm going to bless your wombs. You guys are going to be economically, you're going to be socially, you're going to be culturally, you're going to be family. You're going to be productive and wonderful, and you're going to enjoy just wonderful things. But if you disobey me, if you break my law, if you break my commandments, I'm going to curse you in your fields and in your herds and in your families and that kind of stuff. Now, I know what you're saying. Brian, that's Old Testament. That's nothing to do with us. That's for Israel. They were a covenant people. There's no relevance to us. Yeah, I know. I've heard that one before. How about checking out Romans chapter 1, verse 18 and following, where God says almost exactly the same thing through the Apostle Paul that he said back in Deuteronomy 28 through Moses. And basically in Romans 1, Paul says, look, do you want to look at Roman culture? Do you want to look at Greek culture? Do you want to know why there's such perversion and wickedness and death and destruction and all those kinds of things? You want to know why that is? Because they refuse to acknowledge the God of the Scriptures. And therefore, God gives them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, that their bodies might be dishonored among them. Professionally wise, they become fools. They exchange the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man or birds or four-footed creatures. They're wicked, they're stupid, they're hateful, they're vicious, they're violent, they're perverse, all these kinds of things. Their culture dies because they do not acknowledge the one true God. Now, here's where it gets a little bit sticky. And here's where this one particular lecture is probably going to be broken down into 2 or 3 or 4 portions. The problem is this. Sin affects every aspect of our being. It doesn't just affect our bodies. We get old and sick and weak and we die. Our bodies crave things that they ought not to crave. It doesn't just affect our emotions, where we sometimes feel things that we shouldn't feel, or we don't feel what we should feel. It doesn't just affect our wills, where sometimes we want the wrong things. Sin also affects our minds. It affects our ability to reason. We have this tendency to use our minds to justify, rationalize, and excuse our behavior rather than to critique it and to analyze it according to God's word. And that means is that sometimes even Christians are liable to basically use their minds to justify, rationalize, and excuse our behavior. And that's why if we want to see Christian victory, it's going to come from the family. But it's not going to come by restoring the traditional family. What is the traditional family? How much of the traditional family is actually biblical? How many traditions of men did we pick up and we put into our culture and we adopted as a part of our, that weren't actually true or faithful? How much of what you're doing today in your marriage, as a parent, as a child, as a brother or sister, how much is actually faithful and true to the Scriptures? And how much have you just kind of absorbed by osmosis from the culture of the church around you? Our goal has to be to reclaim God's concept of the family. Now, when I say this, I'm going to say that even Abraham, for example, which lived probably about 2000 BC, something, there was probably undoubtedly, and in fact, there's no doubt about this, there are aspects of his family life that he picked up from his culture, things that were contrary. The whole, thing about him and listening to his wife about Hagar and that kind of stuff, that's right from 2nd millennium BC culture. That's not what God ever revealed. So if even Abraham, our father in the faith, if even he can stumble like that, then we have to be humble to admit that we might stumble as well. And what we need to do is that we need to start looking at certain various aspects of our life. Now, you think, wait a minute, my concept of family is perfectly biblical. It's perfectly legitimate. Well, let me ask you this. And again, I'm not trying to grind a particular axe here, and I'm certainly not trying to say that this is wrong. But if you're a Christian and you're married, how do you know that you're married? And you'll go probably something, well, I met this wonderful person and we talked about it. Then we got engaged, and after we'd gone through engagement or whatever, then we went to a church, probably most likely, and then a minister stood up and he administered the ceremony, and then I said I do and she said I do, and we got kissed, and then we were married, and that's how we got married. Okay, now let me ask you this question, and I'm going to get in so much trouble for this. Where in the Bible does it ever give a minister the authority to perform a wedding? In fact, have you ever actually thought about what weddings were in biblical times, either Old Testament or New Testament? When Jesus did the wedding feast at Cana, when he turned the water into wine. I know that some people don't like to think it was wine. They want to think it was grape juice, but well, that's a different discussion for a different time. Do you ever notice that in all the imagery that we have of weddings and marriage, there's never actually a description that we can actually look at? And again, I'm not trying to say that you were wrong in having a minister perform a ceremony over you. What I'm trying to get you to look at is, where in Scripture does God ever say, this is how I want a marriage to be authenticated or performed? And if you look, and you look at either Old Testament or New Testament marriages, we've got records, we've got ancient documents that tell us about marriage ceremonies, and almost universally, there was no religious component per se in any of these things. Marriage was considered to be something of, like, well, in our terms, common grace. It's something that God gives to all men. And basically, what a marriage was, is it was almost always, Old Testament, New Testament, it was always conducted by the family. So what happened is that these two families get together and they'd say, hey, we've got a son, and they would say, we got a daughter, and how about we betroth them? This often happened when the children were very, very young. Now, quite often, the son, or I should say the husband, was probably 5 to 7 years older than the wife. And the reason for that is because he had to work between 5 and 7 years, depending upon where he was at, in order to get a skill set that he would need in order to work. So he was going to be a carpenter, or a wheelwright, or a tailor, or if he was going to even be a farmer or whatever, he had to have these skills, and it took a long time to get those particular skills. And so basically, when the girl got to be, 14, 15, 16 years old, that kind of thing, when she was, able to have children, that's usually then when, if the husband was, now successful in his calling, then they would solemnize, the two families would come together. And in Hebrew culture, for example, when basically the marriage ceremony consisted of basically bringing the contract, both parents agreeing that the contract had been fulfilled, and then basically there was a big party, and as everyone was having a big party downstairs celebrating the marriage, then the bride and the groom would go upstairs and they would consummate the marriage. There was no rabbi, there was no priest, there was no, minister, even in the New Testament church, that administered some sort of a ceremony. But in fact, it was recognized, because in those days, that there was a contract, that you have that story of, Joseph finding out that Mary is with child and he wants to put her away. And that's because they were betrothed, probably when they were little kids. And, it was actually considered to be adultery if one of the other persons slept with someone outside of it. They were committed to one another because of that particular contract. There was no ceremony that had been done. Now, I'm not saying that us having a ceremony is wrong, and I'm certainly not saying, hey guys, go shack up with your girlfriend, and this is the same thing in God's sight as being marriage. No, it doesn't work that way either. I think what we do is actually very biblical, because we stand before God and man and we take certain vows, recognizing our duties and responsibilities. We have, I think, better understanding of certain things. But what I'm saying is that we've come up with a whole theology of weddings and marriage that's actually not actually in the Scriptures themselves. And that's an innocuous one, that's an innocent one, but my question is, how many other kinds of ideas, concepts, beliefs, practices have we adopted from our culture and never actually submitted them to Scripture, whether or not they're true? See, I think there's a couple of things here. You see, if we want to be strong, loving, gracious, responsible, hardworking people. That doesn't come just because we want to be a certain way. We as people, we're greatly influenced by everyone around us. Our family helps to make us who we are. If we have a bad family, it means that we've got a lot of baggage that we have to carry. But a good family can take some of that baggage away and give us the skills that we need to become more successful in life. We all recognize that certain families, they have a wealthy, somebody, great great grandpa was wealthy or grandpa was wealthy and worked hard, and he passes on an inheritance to his kids, and we all know about, it's kind of a great blessing to have an inheritance that comes down from generation to generation. It means you can go to a better school, for example, or you can buy a house when you first get married without going to a 30-year mortgage. But I'm going to suggest to you that there's also a an emotional inheritance, an intellectual, a cultural inheritance. A good family passes down good values generation after generation. There is an old story. It's probably apocryphal, though I swear I've heard it said multiple times that this actually happened to various people. But it's one of those stories that's kind of good to too good to be true. It's about a young bride. She just gets married, and she wants to make a really nice meal for her husband when they get back from the honeymoon, And so she buys a ham. He's watching her, fix this ham for Sunday dinner, and he sees her cut off the end of the bone. And he says, "Hon, why are you cutting off the end of the ham bone?" He says, "Well, I'm not really sure. I think it has something to do with cooking. I think that by cutting it off, it kind of opens up the capillaries and basically it allows heat to travel up, and so the meat cooks, but I'm not really sure. Let me call my mom." And so she calls her mom and says, "Hey, Mom, how come we cut, this bone off? And how come we do that?" And Mom says, "Well, I think it has to do with, opening up the bone, and letting the inside, but, I don't know. That's what my mom told me. I'm going to call your grandmother." And she calls Grandma and says, "Grandma, you know how we cook ham?" "Yeah." "You know how we always cut the end of the bone off?" "Yeah." "Well, I learned that from you, and I taught little Sally to do it, and she's doing it now too, but why do we do that?" And Grandma says, "Well, honestly, it's because when you were growing up, I didn't have a pan big enough. I had to cut the bone off." Now, I don't know if that's terribly funny. I laughed at it because it kind of illustrates some important points here. Generation after generation, a meme was being passed on. Here's something else. A word meme simply means a social thing that has become a part of the culture and so ingrained that you don't even realize it. And here's one that almost everyone can recognize. When you are a parent and you have a little baby and it makes a mess in its diaper, you may actually say the word caca. At least they said it when I was a kid. "Oh, little babies make caca in his diapers." Well, the word caca is, if you ask what is it, why do you say that? It's like, I don't know. And the reason why is because it's a meme. It's something that's been passed down for over 2,000 years. It's a corruption, at least as far as I understand, of a Greek word that refers to feces. But so for generation after generations, mothers referred to this as caca. And so even after Greek was no longer the universal language, replaced by Latin, and then Latin was no longer the universal language, was replaced by the national languages. So 2,000 years later, mothers still use a meme, a term that they picked up from their mothers, from their mothers, from their mothers, from their mothers. Guys, there are all sorts of family values that we pick up that are exactly the same. Now, all I'm arguing for this particular point, some of them may be as innocuous as cutting off the end of a bone. They might be as innocent as saying caca. Little baby made a caca in his diaper. The reality is that some of them, though, are not so innocuous. And so our goal has got to be to bring every area into submission to King Jesus. Our goal, our responsibility, our task is to really make our families glorify God in whatever we do. If we let the world squeeze us into its mold, then basically the power of the family will be lost. I think that's one of the reasons why the first thing that the fascists, the communists, the humanists, The socialists, all these people, the first thing they want to attack is the Christian form of the family. It's ridicule. Watch any television show, and literally, God help you if you do. Make sure you keep some brain bleach available to clean yourself afterwards. What's the one thing they do? The American father is an idiot. He's a fat, slobby, stupid, drunken, irresponsible, sex-crazed idiot. The wife is beautiful and slim, and she's the one that has any kind of sense. The kids are total retards. They're kind of total particular waste of space, but they're also probably smarter than their parents. In other words, everything in our culture ridicules the family, the Christian family. They want to get rid of it. And now, the only time you'll ever see a family well established if it's a gay family or a blended family or whatever, because the world hates the Christian family. Now I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm going to start another one to do part 2 of part 3 here on the Christian family, because I think we've already gone far enough. Right across the Western world right now, every single nation in the world is at sub-zero population replacement rate. What that means is that French and Germans and English and Italians and Nederlanders and Danish and Swedes and Norwegians and Belgians and everyone else in Europe, Spanish, all of these people, they are having fewer children than are dying. Every generation is actually getting smaller. The only segments of their population that are growing is the immigrant segment, which are mostly Muslims. Islam is going to do right now in Europe, without firing a shot, what they've been trying to do since the 7th century. What they couldn't do by force of arms, they're doing by simply having large families. Now, don't get too arrogant if you're an American, because we've got exactly the same problem. Not quite as bad as the Europeans, and not anywhere near as bad as the Japanese. Japan is the first industrialized nation that's going to basically shrink significantly. Do you know why they're so crazy about robots in Japan? It's not just some weird fetish on their part. They need robots because they've got so many old people starting now for the next 20, 30 years. There's not enough young people to take care of them. And they don't want to open their country to immigrants. They want to retain their Japaneseness. And as a consequence, they need to find workers from somewhere. Their population is shrinking. This is serious stuff. God says it this way: those who hate me love death. And when men try to live contrary to God's rules, God's laws, God's principles, they will suffer destruction. Every Western culture is in danger of dying. I'm going to wrap this up right here. And with this last particular thing, one of the things I did in my doctorate in sociology of religion, reading tons of sociological tripe and rubbish. But one of the things that came through very clear is that stagnant or declining populations are replaced by growing populations. That's almost an inevitability. That's right up there with what goes up must come down kind of sociology. If a population is growing, if they're having children, if they're multiplying, then they're going to displace populations that are not growing. And that means that everything that we hold dear, all the things that we think are important, we're not talking about race here. We're not talking, but we are talking about the good cultural things like responsibility, hard work, gentleness, kindness, mercy, grace. These are not just inevitabilities of human existence. They are the product of certain cultural values. And once the religion is gone that built those values, and it's no longer a memory because the people who used to hold them, they're gone as well, the world gets to be a very, very dark place. Well, that is some dark stuff I'm going to leave you on this time, but I think we've gone far enough today. I want to pick this up again next time with part 2 of part 3, which is on Christian victory in the family. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.